I'd like to thank everyone for coming today to this Mixed Methods webinar series, brought to you in part by the Mixed Methods International Research Association, as well as University of Alberta's International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. Today's speaker will be Dr. Elizabeth Creamer, and she'll be talking about mixed methods approaches to developing grounded theory.
Thank you so much. Let's see if we can get these slides moving forward. Share my screen. Oh dear. Yvette, I thought you were sharing, you were pulling up the slides.
Yeah, just a second. There we go.
All right, that made me nervous. I'm really pleased to be here with everybody and to have this opportunity to do the webinar. There's a lot of interest in this topic, and it's one that has gotten very close to my heart, the idea of this kind of intermethodology mixing that I first started, an interest that first started with my book when I found some really wonderful examples, and now is an interest that is really growing and embracing some other things that really fascinate me about mixed methods. So I appreciate y'all being here. I know there were different messages about the time, and I apologize for that. Some of that's my fault, confusing Eastern time and Mountain time, but here we are all together. So let me talk to you a little bit about what I want to try to do today. I think we're pushing the window a little bit forward today in what I'm talking about. So I'm not going over, by and large, well-trodden ground that you could pick up from reading some of the real foundational voices in grounded theory. But instead, I want to kind of look forward and propose some creative ways that mixed methods and grounded theory can be combined to produce explanatory frameworks or theoretical models. And I'll be interested to hear later on how this might involve your own work. So these are my kind of goals. I need to provide an overview of some of the potential value added and the purposes that could be gained by integrating both qualitative and quantitative data in a mixed method way to develop and refine theory. So my interest here and my focus in what I'm talking about isn't so much applying existing theories, which is very important and a good standard of quality in research. But I'm really more fascinated with the idea of developing theory. And of course, in qualitative and grounded theory, that's developing theory inductively in a way that is inductive or emergent, that it comes from the data rather than from the literature. So the first goal here is to provide an overview. I'm going to frame some of the examples that I provide later on in a research project that was recently completed by one of my doctoral students, Janice Austin. She did a qualitative study about the undergraduate research experience, but I'm also doing 2 other projects involving the undergraduate research experience where they have mixed methods components. So the undergraduate research experience is something that's offered to undergraduates to encourage an interest in STEM, and the idea is it gives them very practical and applied and a real sense of what it means to be a scientist and a researcher. I want to provide details about a few of the steps in mixing and how you can integrate qual and quant data in a grounded theory. And I particularly want to talk about 2 areas or 2 steps that can be used in the development of a grounded theory that I think has tremendous potential for mixing of qualitative and quantitative data in ways that lead to new insight. I've put some material in a shared folder in a Google Drive that if you have this password, you can access them. You probably won't be able to just cut and paste this link until you actually see the PowerPoints that will be uploaded with the webinar. But if you get this link, you'll be able to get the PowerPoints as well as an article that I finished this year that is the first extended piece that really looks at examples of mixed methods applications to grounded theory. So let me just say a little bit more about myself and my background. This is my author profile in Amazon, which I can't quite believe I really have, but it's related to my book. And really, I think the couple of important things that I want to say about my background is I think what's different about what I bring to this textbook is really an overtly qualitative orientation. I really, truly am convinced that it's only when the two are combined and the QUAL in particular is allowed to play a strong role that I believe that you can really have the potential for innovation and new insight. As Yvette mentioned in the intro, I have been teaching advanced doctoral courses in both grounded theory, that's one course, and in mixed methods for about 15 years. And it was from that I was instigated into developing a textbook. My approach to grounded theory is very influenced by Kathy Sharma's. Most people that do grounded theory, particularly formal grounded theory, identify with particular foundational voices. Many go with Glaser and Strauss, some with Strauss and Corbin. Sharma's, to me, is the leading voice in grounded theory now. She has offered a constructivist view of grounded theory. I personally think that a constructivist view embraces both qualitative and quantitative research. I don't find that combination awkward. In a constructivist view, you view them both as constructed by the researcher as ways of making meaning that are shaped by the researcher and are subjective. So I see both qualitative and quantitative research as subjective, and I don't see that as a negative thing. So everyone brings a different definition to mixed methods of research, which may trouble some, but actually I think it's a source of dynamism and energy. There is a strong overlapping commitment to the belief that it combines qualitative and quantitative data and procedures. Everyone agrees to that core concept, and that's what distinguishes it from multi-methods research. I've added a twist that I really believe that research undertaken with a mindset that Green refers to as a mixed method way of thinking really benefits by the idea that you want multiple and different perspectives. That's different than constantly seeking confirmation and agreement. The idea of emphasizing this is really emphasizing that sometimes it's the so-called outliers, it's the so-called extreme cases. I'm putting quotes marks around those words because that's quant language, that you'll find some of the subtlety and nuance in your research that inevitably emerges when you're pursuing complex, multifaceted factors that involve people and environments and the interaction between the two. So I've really added this phrase here, the commitment to meaningfully engage multiple perspectives. I see that as central to the mixed method way of thinking. My textbook is called An Introduction to Fully Integrated Mixed Methods Research. And I think what it offers is, for the first time, is the idea that this commitment to engaging qual and quant can extend from the very beginning, the way a research is conceptualized, the way research questions are formed, through the way data collection is done, through analysis, and through the final stage. I think there has been an implicit assumption heretofore that mixing is always something that the qual and quant are integrated at the interpretation stage, at the last stage. And really the argument that I put forward is that way underestimates the potential of mixed methods, and I think sort of underscores the foundational arguments that qual and quant are so different, which is something I also quarrel with. So you'll see as I talk, I'll talk about ways to code that involve mixing. I'll talk about ways to do analysis and give you some examples that involve mixing. And I think that is where the true power of mixed methods lays. It's important to do a little bit of terminology in distinguishing what is meant by a theory, a grounded theory, and a conceptual framework. Some quantitative researchers, I think, struggle with the idea that grounded theory produced through qualitative methods is a theory, because they are often operating from a definition that a theory is something that is well substantiated across contexts. It's something you see in the literature. And grounded theory is quite different than that. It is context specific. It is generated out of a specific context, and it is generated through an inductive process that really can also have a deductive. I don't have any trouble calling that theory, and when I use the word theory, that's what I'm talking about. But I think it's important to recognize that some quant researchers, more conventional researchers, are uncomfortable with that definition. We could fold it all under the broader umbrella of a conceptual framework. All of these are explanatory frameworks. And in our world, in the applied world, an explanatory framework is interested in how and why something works, how and why an activity, a program, a strategy promotes certain kinds of change or promotes certain kinds of outcomes. An explanatory framework is always interested in the question not only just of what, that's descriptive, but of why and how. Why does certain activity work in certain environments? How does it promote the kind of change we're trying to promote? All of that can go under a sort of generic term of a conceptual framework, but you'll find me kind of hopping back and forth in the language I use because I think I'm more flexible in my views of those definitions. Mixed methods grounded theory, and if I can use that abbreviation, is a type of methodological mixing. It's also a method mixing that uses the foundational assumptions of both grounded theory and mixed methods. So it mixes both method and methodology. Anyone talking about grounded theory needs to be sensitive about the distinction between what I call little GT and big GT. When you're talking about the methodological assumptions that go with grounded theory, then you're talking about big GT, the methodology. The principle, big GT, is the idea that you're producing knowledge, you're producing theory through a systematic, inductive process. And you believe that the theory you produce as a whole explains your phenomena in a very specific context. That's methodology. That's big GT. Little GT is the methods you use to get to the theory, the steps in the process that you use to get to the theory. That's little GT, that's methods. Methods I associate with procedures. So if you look at the difference briefly of the methods and the methodology, I've already mentioned a couple of the elements that are key to the assumptions, the methodological assumptions. One, that you're using an inductive logic, an emergent logic. You're not starting with pre-established hypotheses that are driven from the literature. Your endpoint is theory. So if you have an existing theory that someone like Bandura or Vygotsky have produced, you're hard-pressed to make an argument that it's the grounded theory label is the best use for your project. You may use grounded theory methods to add to the theory or test the theory, but the methodology is different when you're using an existing theory. You're probably somewhat familiar with the traditional steps that are used to develop that are associated with grounded theory, also sometimes called constant comparison. I'm not going to go over those here. They're well documented by Strauss and Corbin, as well as by Sharmas. They're well accepted. They begin with open coding, they move to focus coding, they move to generation of themes in a very systematic and iterative process. Those are the methods that are foundational to both GT and big GT, little GT and big GT. When I talk about fully integrated grounded theory methods, and this is what I envision in the in-press article that's in the Dropbox, again, I want to frame it as thinking about how you mix at each of the phases, how you mix at the design phase, during data collection, during data analysis, and drawing conclusions. And you'll see that when I move into the steps. So let's imagine some different purposes for using theory for integrating mixed methods in theory development across the phases. So you might imagine in the first phase that you're using the combination of QUAL and QUANT to identify key constructs, to refine and focus your research question, and if by chance you're doing a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experiment or an experiment, to help you design an intervention. So many people begin an intervention, an activity or a strategy designed to promote change with a preliminary model that sometimes includes personal experience, the experience of practitioners, and knowledge from the literature. This is not the same as testing a theory. It's still constructing a context-specific theory in a very preliminary way in the first stage. So I would argue that's the first place that you see where QUAL and QUANT are coming together. During data collection, you see the integration of QUAL and QUANT, and as the model, the preliminary model, is transferred into data collection instruments. So the model that might be developed in an initial phase is used to design your interview protocol, to design if you have observation and observation protocol. It might be used to design a survey or many of the other different techniques. So the theory that's developed at the preliminary stage is carried through to that data collection stage. During data analysis, that theory drives theoretical coding. So I'm an advocate for a more targeted type of coding that is more focused on the research questions and on generating relationships and populating that model than in the sort of standard inductive open coding approach. This leads to further theory development and refinement. It adds things to models, it takes things out, and then helps you move into bringing together your conclusions, to pursuing unexpected findings, and eventually can contribute to practice and to offer pathways for future research. So this is envisioning the integration of QUAL and QUANT through multiple phases, all for purposes of developing and refining theory. So if we look at some more reasons why you might be interested in mixing to develop theory and mixed method grounded theory, you could look at some of the classic purposes for using a mixed methods approach and overlay those with thinking about developing theory. So for instance, some people, and in fact, probably the original thrust of first consideration of mixed methods grounded theory, really saw it simply as a validation technique. So some early work really saw it that first you develop a model qualitatively, and then you test it quantitatively to confirm it, to see which parts pan out. So that would fit what is known as a triangulation or confirmatory purpose. The complementarity purpose keeps QUAL and QUANT separate, constructs separate as you develop a theoretical model, and it imagines that some constructs might come out of QUAL and some might come out of QUANT, but it doesn't seem to imagine that you could have QUAL and QUANT data for both types of constructs. So typically QUANT is thought of as the outcomes of an intervention or activity. Do people change? Do their attitudes change? Do their behaviors change? People typically assume that's QUANT-based data, but of course it could be QUAL. People typically assume that when you're trying to understand contextual factors that might influence why an activity or intervention is effective in certain settings, why something works in certain settings, people think of that as QUAL because it's a feature of a grounded theory, but of course it can be both. Expansion fits when your model is really embracing views of people at multi-levels of an organization. So if you have a study where you, for instance, are talking to teachers, students, and principals, that's a multi-level design. You would naturally expect that they would have different views and bring different ideas to your theory. Initiation is a purpose and design I absolutely adore. As a matter of fact, it's my new best bud. And that is using a contradiction and paradox to build theory. And that's something that I'm writing about right now. So let's look at one of these models, what one of these models might look like when you are combining QUAL and QUANT data. Now, I know this is really, really busy. And I'm not going to try to break down the whole thing for you, but I want to point to what's basic in this model and then what's super original in this model. And there's really only 2 of these models in the literature, and this was from this Japanese student's research about the impact of an intervention on participants. So you'll see that this has some classic features. It has outcomes, and at the center, the kind of process participants went through. It looks at factors or conditions that influence it. But what's unusual about the way this model is drawn is that a distinction is made in the coloring and the shading, and from what is derived from QUAL, QUANT, or both. So she uses an oval to show QUAL data supports this. She uses a rectangle to show QUANT data supports this. And then another strategy to show I've got both QUAL and QUANT that supports this construct. What's also super wonderful about this chart figure, and why I can get excited, is notice the paths, the arrows. So she's got some paths that she developed out of her QUAL coding, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit, and some that she developed out of her QUANT coding. So the idea of developing connections or relationships between variables has not heretofore been thought of something that can be done in a qualitative way. But I'm going to show you ways that that can be done. So really in the past, it's always been assumed that you're going to show a relationship with a variable, that only QUANT can do that. And she's really depicting here not only the paths and the constructs, but the data that support this. And this is one of the reasons that that makes this a very, very strong figure. So I've talked about a little bit about this already in the table about purposes, but let me reiterate a couple of things. What can be added by creatively integrating QUAL and QUANT data and mixed methods grounded theory? We talked about the triangulation design. So the first thing you could say is strengthen evidence of the construct validity through triangulating QUAL and QUANT data. Secondly, it can add constructs to a model that are unexpected. And even in a model that you've developed from the literature, you may add constructs because you're in a new setting or you have a new population that will make your model more specific. It can also remove constructs that might have been expected, that you from your own personal experience expected, but it's not there. And I'll show you an example of that. And then very simply, you can use some strategies for sampling by using quant data to pick samples of participants to follow up with. So let me pause here. I'm right about halfway, and I haven't, I'm just mostly giving you an overview, and we'll move in the next 10-15 minutes getting into some nitty-gritty. But if a few of you can just type into the chat box what kinds of things let me know, are you planning to use grounded theory in the research you're doing? So just type in the chat box, yes, I'm planning to use grounded theory and mixed methods. I'm thinking about it. So give me a little feedback here so I can see what kind of interest there, how you might be using it. And I'm getting a little message that lots of people are typing, so a few will pop up in a minute. So I'm hoping that this is relevant to what you're doing, and eventually you'll come up with some ideas. Yes, I'm already using mixed methods in educational research. I'm planning and using grounded theory and mixed methods. Perfect. Erica's saying, so, oh, these are going too fast now. Yes, I'm very interested. Yeah, this is great. Thank you. I'm planning to use 2 strands of a qualitative study to create a strategy for mixing. The whole idea of mixing qual is mixing multiple quals is another sort of exciting area for innovation. So some more people are typing. I'm using quantitative heavily. Yeah, you can develop a model quantitatively initially and then embellish it or refine it with qualitative. I've not yet used it. Oh, this is great. Annette's typing, Krista's typing. For participatory evaluation, oh, that is great. I want to know. Okay, this is good. This is great. Thank you so much for all those little entries. I hope we can save those because we're spot on here. And I think we'll move now into giving you some more ideas about that you can play with. And I want to really emphasize that these are starting off points. These are places, it's like a diving board that you can jump off. It just gives you some ideas. It does not say there's only one way to do this. It's a way to think, oh, well, I could do this with my study. Oh, this might work. So that's what I'm kind of hoping, that it prompts some things. So I'm going to skip over some, well, let me go back to some overlap I've already mentioned between mixed methods and intervention, and this is also participatory and evaluation research. Both are complex, both are multi-layered, addressing complex contracts. They're interested in both anticipated and unanticipated outcomes. You'll see those in the model. Trying to figure out what and why people change, and that's the underlying process or mechanism. And also trying to understand the role of context, the space, the physical space where an event occurs or where an intervention occurs, or the individual qualities that impact how that intervention actually is effective and not effective. So there is tremendous three-way compatibility here between mixed methods, intervention, and evaluation research, and certainly participatory research is right in there as well. There is a generic set of research questions that are compatible with grounded theory. These are almost synonymous with the models. Does the intervention, does the activity, does the event promote change in attitudes and knowledges? What strategies are associated with those changes? And what variables, individual and contextual, influence that? So I've talked about it, and when we saw Kawamura, we sort of saw the generic model, and here I'm bringing up the major pieces in the model, and again highlighting how you can distinguish qual, quant, and mixed paths that where you have both qual and quant data. And then I want to show you, but I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I want to mention it. This is the second beautiful grounded theory mixed method model from a publication by Shim. This is in the reference list that's in the Google documents. This is a beautiful model. She does not do the job of distinguishing qual and quant, but this is a full grounded theory model that you might develop from your own research. So this is a model that I developed from my own research, or this combination of research about the undergraduate research experience. Let me pick a few things out here so we can move into some of the examples quickly here. So from this, came to the conclusion that there were some things that were really operating and were really important in the undergraduate experience. And that included the type of condition that I referred to, the intensity of the experience, the length of the experience, as well as the variety of the experiences. So in order to maximize the potential for creative ways to integrate, let me give you 3 tips about how to do that. If you're going to use mixed methods and you want to maximize your potential for integration, then first you want to have overlapping or embedded qualitative and quantitative samples of participants. They don't have to be identical, but it's very helpful if you have qual and quant data from the same sample or subsample. It's mandatory and very helpful that you have qual and quant data on the same constructs. That's where you get some leverage. And it's also very helpful if you have a validated instrument of some kind that you can use. So let me talk about some of the key steps in developing a model. And I'm watching the time here, so I've got about 10 minutes or so. And I really want to focus on these two steps here. This is sort of an overview of the steps that begin with constructing a model, an initial model and the questions, collecting and analyzing qual and quant data. But I want to talk to you about these two pieces, the use of theoretical memos and then coding of those theoretical memos. And this part is new in some ways from what you would have read in Shim or what you would have read elsewhere. Let me give you an example of a very brief memo, and I'm calling this a theoretical memo. And a memo like this could be about a single participant. It could be about a site or location. It could be if you're doing a systematic review or a content analysis, you could end up developing a theoretical memo about each article. A theoretical memo is the first step in data consolidation. It's the first step you may be moving from transcripts, for instance. It's your first step in analysis where you're beginning to synthesize. And what it does is it provides a way to integrate and see the relationship between some quantitative indexes you have, some scores that you have on quantitative measures, and to see their potential connection to the qualitative data. So I'm not going to read this because we're kind of tight on time already, but you'll see that this is sort of describing the experience of a student in the lab. And you can see that she doesn't have a very high research identity, only 2 of 4. And therefore, you might try to read this memo if you're interested in undergraduate research experience to understand why this person maybe has a score of 2. What would explain that might be in the memo? So a memo like this is the first stage of data reduction. I'm also arguing and have seen the benefits of using this as a principal place to do your coding. Most theoretical memos might run 2-3 pages, depending on the amount of data you have. You can always go back to your raw data in a transcript, but this begins to make it easier for you to see patterns. So I am proposing, and I've had good luck with using theoretical coding in memos. I would call that a type of focused or targeted coding. It's very different from inductive or emergent coding, although it can have an emergent phase to it. You can use it as a way to link constructs, link, for instance, outcomes to context. Where does a certain outcome occur? You can use it to generate themes, and you can also use it deductively to test themes. Now, many of the ideas for theoretical coding that I'm proposing come from Johnny Saldina's book, The Coding Manual for Qualitative Research. I really think that Saldina has just launched qualitative coding into a brand new area. I think he has really moved the idea of qualitative coding forward in ways that are very, very compatible with mixed methods. This is really a compendium. I mean, I can't even count how many codes he investigates and proposes, but it's just a wonderful idea to spark new ideas. So let me illustrate briefly a couple of different types of coding in just the few minutes that I have left. This is a passage that you might have from a theoretical memo where you identify an outcome, in this case you coded outcome, increased or decreased interest in research in this case. What's promoting it? You code that a mechanism, and then you go back and you look at the context where that's occurring. This kind of coding is very familiar in process evaluation, context mechanism outcome, or context outcome coding, and it can be used to generate qualitative themes. So for instance, in this particular incident, the person is saying, when the work has no practical implications, I'm not motivated. And when I'm not motivated, this is not the kind of work I want to do. So let me jump forward to another example of intensity coding. This is in intensity coding, you create scales. These are ordinal scales, they have levels, and you can use them then in quantitative analysis. So this is where you move from the qualitative data into the potential to do quantitative data analysis with data that is ordinal, hierarchical, but only ordinal. So one of the theories that came out of this research quickly is that the level of responsibility a person had in their experience influenced their interest in continuing in research, and that the jobs they did influenced it. If they stuck to low-level jobs, they really never saw the full potential of doing this kind of research. So in this kind of coding, you would go into a memo and assign a level of responsibility to the person's description of what they did. You would determine what's the highest level are they describing of activities, and hopefully you find a way to translate that. So if they're only saying, well, all I ever did was clean cages in a rat lab, that's a little bit lower level activity than a person who's able to go on and design a study and write a manuscript. So this is a form of intensity or scale coding that can be applied to qualitative data in a form of theoretical coding. Very, very powerful. It can create data that supports links between qualitative and quantitative data that otherwise wouldn't be available. Let me show you quickly another very foxy way of integrating qual and quant data. I had suggested that it's very helpful if you have a validated survey instrument, perhaps about some of your outcomes, and or perhaps that you've constructed. In this example of mixing that I take from an exemplar that's in my book in the chapter about data transformation, this is the first time I've ever seen someone qualitatively analyze their data, separately analyze their quantitative data, compare the two, generate those qualitative themes, possibly from those theoretical memos, and then go into survey to see if they can find matching items to test their qualitative themes and to see if they work in a predictive model. So this is the qualitative driving the quantitative analysis rather than the much more common quantitative driving the qualitative. So I've got to skip over quite a few things here and just wrap up by noting a couple of tensions and a couple of summary points and leaving us a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry about that, but sure, my email is on the opening slide, and I'm certainly welcome any questions you might have about projects you're doing on. But I've suggested that these are innovative and creative ways of using mixed methods with grounded theory. I have found I have two examples in my book and two examples that I've talked about today that actually produced formal models. So you're pushing the window and pushing some new ground here. It challenges some of the views about grounded theory. For instance, the idea of developing a model may seem to conflict with grounded theory, but as long as it is done in a qualitative way, I do not see a conflict. You need to be aware that the QUAL view of causality represented in grounded theory is very, very different than a QUANT view of causality. They are not derived at in similar ways at all. The logic is entirely different, and Joseph Maxwell is the one that's talked the most about that. A reservation is the bigger your paths and the more paths you develop in the context mechanism coding. You're going to have to collapse those into larger categories, or you'll have too many discrete paths to be usable. So summarizing, I'm thinking that we have many ideas about systematic ways to approach theory development that combines mixed methods and grounded theory. I've argued that it's readily adaptable to intervention and evaluation research, and that there are great ways to explore the key elements of grounded theory models, and that both QUAL and QUANT data can be collected with many elements of a theoretical model, and that you narrow yourself if you divide them out. I encourage you to think of those together. So I had some additional slides, but we only have about 6 minutes left. So let me give you just a few minutes to post some questions in the chat, or if you're feeling like you brave and you want to raise your hand, you can use Adobe Connect and help ask some questions that I'm sure lots of other people have that we've covered quite a bit of material. So see if we can get 4 or 5 good questions going here before we have to wrap up. So I'll give you a minute to think. I see some typing. Let's see what we've got. People typing.
I think we have our first question from Erica. Hi, Elizabeth. What are your thoughts on using mixed method grounded theory with secondary analysis?
I applaud it. Totally underscore and think it's a very smart way to go. I really believe that there are wonderful sets of data out there that can be used in very productive ways. I do not think that you have to generate your own data to do good research. I think it's very wise to use other people's data sets and to amend them in ways that can be useful to you. I could imagine in mixed methods, even in a secondary data set, you could find qualitative ways to add to those data sets. So I think that's a great strategy. I think it's a very effective strategy.
Then you've got Dr. Azra Falsafi. I used meta-analysis and systematic review developing a new framework for education. Then I'm using QUANT to validate the framework. Is this valid enough, or shall I add more steps?
That is a very strong design. As a matter of fact, there's another person on this webinar who's a student of mine who is doing that exact thing, though not meta-analysis in the quant way that term is used, but doing a systematic review. I think a systematic review is well suited to mixed methods and grounded theory. So I think you're on to something that is not only methodologically strong, but innovative, but very innovative. So kudos.
Perfect. And now we have you. Can you say more about the accessibility of terminology such as validity in relation to mixed methods grounded theory?
Maria, I can. I would refer you to an article by Tony Amaguzzi and a colleague of his. He argues for a special term in mixed methods legitimation framework. He offers what he refers to as a legitimation framework because he feels like the word validity is too strongly associated with quantitative and qualitative, and he prefers to keep the language separate. When mixed methods was first formed, one of the arguments about the similarities was this idea that validity crosses qual and quant, but as mixed methods develops more, then its own language becomes more important. And if you need information on that site, Maria, shoot me an email and I'll send you the site to that article. Legitimation criteria, they call it. Very good language. Great. Oh, someone's already put the link up. Woo! That's very nice.
The literature review should be in the beginning or at the end?
I am going traditionally in grounded theory. I'm getting the echo here. Maybe you can mute him. In traditional grounded theory, the view is the literature review comes at the end. I'm contesting that and challenging that and providing many examples of where a preliminary model is developed from multiple sources, including consulting the literature. I think it is naive to think that you can design a study without consulting the literature. Where you would go awry is if you said you were using grounded theory to test an existing theoretical framework. There's a mixed match there. So how the literature reviews, there are very different approaches to it. I think literature belongs in the beginning, the middle, and the end. I think you consult the literature as you try to make sense of your findings. I think you consult it in the beginning as you form your research questions. I think you consult it in the end as you try to make sense of your findings. So views about the literature review are changing in grounded theory because, like all methodologies, it's evolving. Very good question, though.
Thank you very much, Dr. Creamer. All right, so we are out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming today. Our next mixed method webinar will be on April 10th, and we'll have Jennifer Green, and her topic will be the mixed methods way of thinking.
Yes.
So the link for that will be up on the IIQM website shortly after this webinar. So hopefully we'll see you all next month. Elizabeth, did you have any closing words?
No, I can tell you Jennifer Green will do a wonderful webinar. We share many of the ways we think, including that mixed method way of thinking. Thank you all for being so responsive. I'm really excited to see some of your comments in the chat. So again, feel free to email me. I'm happy to respond to emails.
Great. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month. Take care.